London is wrapped in fog, and where others see chaos, he finds the truth. The legendary detective Sherlock Holmes is back in the game. Welcome to the channel. Put on your headphones and unravel new mysteries alongside him. It was one of those November mornings when London seems to breathe mist instead of air. A damp, grey and unwelcoming hour that makes even the gas lamps burn with a kind of weary resignation. I was at my writing desk in our familiar sitting room at 221B Baker Street, attempting to summarize a recent case of my friend Sherlock Holmes, when the clatter of cab wheels stopped beneath our window and quick steps sounded upon the stairs. Holmes, who was lounging in his armchair in his dressing gown, pipe in hand and eyes half closed, looked up even before a knock came at the door. "Lestrade, if I am not mistaken," he murmured. Indeed, a moment later the sharp-featured face of Inspector Lestrade appeared. He removed his bowler hat and looked about him with the air of a man who has already exhausted ordinary explanations and has come in search of the extraordinary. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes. I trust I find you well. We've a queer business near Regent's Park. I'd not trouble you, but it's got the yard scratching its head." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden interest. "Pray, sit down, Lestrade. What has happened? A murder or an accident? It's hard to say," the inspector began, warming his hands by the fire. "A gentleman, well dressed and of some means, found dead under the gaslight at Hanover Terrace. No marks of violence, save a bruise upon the temple. But here's the odd part. The body was wearing a woman's cashmere coat, a fine one too, cream-coloured, trimmed with sable, quite out of place." "A woman's coat?" I exclaimed. "Yes, Doctor, and several sizes too small. The dead man's own overcoat was nowhere to be found. There's more. His watch had stopped at precisely 17 minutes past 10, and there was a theatre ticket stub in his waistcoat pocket. St. James's Theatre, yesterday evening. Lastly," Lestrade added with some embarrassment, "there was a faint scent of lilac perfume clinging to the coat." Holmes leaned forward, the fingers of one hand steepled against the other, his gaze distant yet keen. "A woman's garment, a missing coat, a stopped watch and a theatre ticket. Each a thread, Lestrade, but whether they form a pattern or a tangle remains to be seen. When was the body discovered?" "Just after midnight. The fog was thick enough to hide an elephant. A constable on his beat nearly stumbled over the man." Holmes rose, drew on his coat, and reached for his hat. "Watson, if you can spare a morning, this promises interest. Lestrade, your cab is waiting." 10 minutes later, we were rattling through streets still half drowned in fog. The horses' hooves made dull echoes, and the lamps blurred into halos of mist. Holmes, as usual, was silent during the drive, his sharp features cast in thought. Once, he muttered to himself, "A coat too small, placed or worn. That distinction may be vital." We reached Hanover Terrace, where a knot of curious onlookers had gathered near a lamppost. The constable on duty saluted, and Lestrade led us into the small paved courtyard where the body still lay, decently covered but waiting for the coroner. Holmes knelt beside it, drawing back the tarpaulin. The dead man's face was pale, handsome, and about 40 years of age. He wore evening dress, his gloves still upon his hands. The cream-coloured cashmere coat, of delicate texture and unmistakably feminine cut, was draped over him like a shroud. Holmes examined it minutely, noting the embroidered initials CD within the lining. "The coat is of the finest quality," he murmured, "and the scent, lilac unmistakably. Doctor, observe the temple. The bruise is small but decisive. A fall perhaps, but not a violent blow. Lestrade, was there mud on his shoes when found?" "None, Mr. Holmes." "Then he was not walking far before death took him, or else he was moved here after death." Holmes straightened and turned to me. "Do you perceive, Watson, how the fog serves the guilty as a veil and the innocent as a snare? But let us not anticipate. What of his possessions?" Lestrade handed him a small envelope. Inside were a gold watch, stopped at 10:17, a theatre ticket stub marked St. James's Theatre, row D, seat 8, and a handkerchief embroidered with the initials ED. Holmes smiled faintly. CD on the coat, ED on the handkerchief. A husband and wife, perhaps, or a curious coincidence. "Has he been identified?" "Not yet," said Lestrade, "but the tailor's mark inside his waistcoat should help. Denham and Fry, Cornhill. We're making inquiries." Holmes nodded, pocketed the ticket stub, and rose. "Lestrade, have the body taken to the yard for proper examination. Watson, we shall visit Cornhill next. I have a notion that the name Denham will not be unfamiliar before the day is done." As we drove off once more through the smothering fog, Holmes remained thoughtful, his gaze fixed upon the blurred outlines of passing figures. At last, he said quietly, "You recall, Watson, the curious case of the blue carbuncle when a man's goose led us to a jewel thief? Here, perhaps, a lady's coat will lead us to the truth. The smallest garment, my dear fellow, may cloak the largest secret." I could not help but shiver, not from the cold, but from the sense that beneath this simple mystery lay one of those tangled webs that only my friend's remarkable intellect could unweave. The morning traffic had begun to stir in the streets by the time our hansom drew up before the premises of Denham and Fry, tailors and outfitters, Cornhill. The establishment presented that air of discreet prosperity peculiar to tradesmen who serve the professional and moneyed classes. A discreet clerk, when shown Holmes's card, conducted us into a private office, where a portly gentleman with silver hair rose to receive us. "Mr. Fry," said Holmes pleasantly, "we are making inquiries regarding a customer of yours, Mr. Ernest Denham." The tailor's brow furrowed. "Ah, yes, Mr. Denham of Denham and Cozer, the bankers. A most excellent client, sir. I regret to hear—" "You have heard of his death, then?" "Only this morning, from one of our other customers. Is it indeed true? He was here but last week for a fitting." Holmes inclined his head. "Could you tell us whether he had an overcoat made recently?" "Certainly. A grey vicuña lined with silk, completed only a fortnight ago." "And has it been delivered?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes. It was sent to his residence in Harley Street 3 days past." Holmes took this in without expression, then said, "I thank you. You have been of service." Outside once more, the fog had lifted slightly, showing the spectral outlines of hansoms and omnibuses along the street. Holmes drew me aside. A banker of Harley Street, a wife's initials within a woman's coat, and a missing overcoat of grey vicuña. The pattern begins to take shape, Watson, though the fabric is yet incomplete. Our next destination was Harley Street, where a neat brass plate proclaimed Mr. Ernest Denham, banker. A housemaid, pale and nervous, admitted us into a drawing room whose every ornament betrayed wealth and taste. Presently, Mrs. Denham entered, a handsome woman in her early 30s, dressed in black silk and wearing a small brooch of pearls at her throat. "I have been expecting you, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly. "Inspector Lestrade telephoned an hour ago. My husband—" Her voice faltered, and she pressed a handkerchief to her lips. "Is it true he is dead?" "I regret to confirm it, madam," said Holmes gently. "He was found last night near Regent's Park. You have my sympathy. I must, however, ask a few questions." She sat down, her composure admirable, save for a faint trembling of the hands. "I will answer as best I can. Your husband left home yesterday evening?" "Yes. He dined here at 7:30, then said he had business at his office. He left about 8. "Did he often work late?" "Frequently." Holmes looked at her keenly. "Was there any disagreement between you?" A moment's hesitation. "None of consequence. My husband was preoccupied of late. Financial matters, I suppose?" Holmes nodded slowly. "One further question, Mrs. Denham. Do you own a cream-colored cashmere coat trimmed with sable, bearing your initials inside the lining?" Her eyes widened. "Yes, it was mine. But how did you know?" "It was found upon your husband's body." A cry escaped her lips, and she rose, pale as marble. "Impossible. That coat was stolen from me a week ago. I meant to report it, but thought it hopeless." "Stolen?" Holmes's tone remained courteous, but his gaze sharpened. "From where?" "From the cloakroom of the St. James's Theatre. I attended a matinee with a friend last Thursday. When I sent the maid to fetch it, it had vanished. I assumed some mistake." Holmes glanced at me meaningfully. "Curious, Watson. Her coat disappears at the very theatre from which her husband's ticket was found." "Indeed," I murmured. Mrs. Denham, regaining some composure, continued. "My husband knew nothing of it. I purchased the coat at Madame Lefebvre's in Bond Street last month." Holmes rose. "I thank you, madam. I shall not trouble you further at present. If I may advise, you would do well to remain at home today." When we were outside again, I could not restrain my curiosity. "Surely, Holmes, this coincidence is too striking. The husband dies in his wife's stolen coat. Might she not have—" "My dear Watson," said Holmes, smiling faintly, "you leap like a hound before the scent is sure. The lady's distress was genuine, her emotion unstudied. Yet the theatre link is no coincidence. Let us pay our respects to Madame Lefebvre's establishment and see what light the trade of fashion may shed upon that of finance." The shop in Bond Street was a temple to feminine luxury. Mirrors, silks, and the faint aroma of expensive perfume. Madame Lefebvre herself, a trim Frenchwoman with shrewd eyes, received us graciously when Holmes showed his card. "Ah, yes, the cashmere coat. But of course, Monsieur Holmes, I remember perfectly. Madame Denham purchased it last month. A very fine lady. It was altered slightly to her figure." "Did you sell another of the same style?" "Non, monsieur. It was unique in this season's collection." "Then whoever possessed it last must have taken it from Mrs. Denham, or from her cloakroom." Holmes bowed slightly. "You have been most helpful." As we left, Holmes said in a low tone, "It seems the theatre is the common thread, Watson. The husband had a ticket for last evening. The wife lost her coat there a week ago. We must learn whom he met within those walls. To the St. James's Theatre." By the time we reached it, the afternoon was drawing in. The fog, driven off by a faint wind, had returned in thin veils that clung about the lampposts. The manager received Holmes with professional courtesy. "Mr. Denham? Yes, I recall him. He occupied a seat in the 4th row last night. The play ended at 10:15. He left hurriedly. Was he alone? Not quite. He spoke to one of our actresses, Miss Violet Kerr, at the stage door. Would it be possible to see Miss Kerr? A few minutes later, we were shown into a small dressing room. Miss Kerr was a striking young woman, fair-haired, with expressive grey eyes and a look of fatigue that spoke of late hours and worry. "Mr. Holmes," she said, after he had introduced himself, "you have come about poor Mr. Denham. I heard of his death this morning. It's dreadful." "You knew him well?" "He came often to the theatre, perhaps 3 times in the last fortnight. We spoke, yes, but he was always kind and proper. I cannot think how such a thing could happen." Holmes's gaze rested on her dressing table, where a small bottle labelled lilac essence stood among cosmetics. "You did not meet him last night after the performance?" Her glance wavered. No, I did not." "Yet the doorkeeper says otherwise," said Holmes quietly, "and he noted that you seemed distressed when you left." For a moment she seemed about to protest, then sank into a chair, her eyes brimming with tears. "I swear I did not harm him. He said he must speak with me, something about money, about a woman who might ruin him. We talked in the alley behind the theatre. Then someone passed near, and he hurried away into the fog. That is the last I saw of him." Holmes regarded her gravely. "Did he wear his overcoat when he left?" I believe so. A grey one. He seemed frightened, Mr. Holmes. Truly frightened." Holmes inclined his head. "Thank you, Miss Kerr. You have helped us more than you know." When we were once again in the hansom, Holmes leaned back and drew a long breath. "Watson, we have 3 facts: a banker in peril, a frightened actress, and a vanished coat. Denham's life last night was a play acted in 2 scenes, the theatre and the fog. Before we close the curtain, we must find who wrote the final act." The following morning dawned clear, with a brittle November chill in the air that seemed to sharpen the outlines of London's streets. I found Holmes already at breakfast, his long fingers drumming the edge of the table, his coffee untouched. The newspapers lay scattered around him, but it was plain from his expression that none contained the information he sought. "Lestrade called," he said without looking up. "He confirms the dead man's identity beyond question. Ernest Denham, partner in the banking firm of Denham & Co. A respected house, though lately there have been rumours of speculation and uneasiness." His accounts were, apparently, not in the order expected of so cautious a man. There is talk of missing securities. "Then perhaps his death was not mere accident," I suggested. Holmes gave me a sidelong glance. "You leap again, my dear fellow, but you may be right, though not in the way you imagine. Come, we must call upon Lestrade at Scotland Yard before he entangles the threads beyond redemption." Within the hour, we were in Lestrade's small office. The inspector was in good humour, having the satisfaction of a case that drew public attention. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, you'll be glad to hear we've found a clue that settles it. Robbery and flight, plain as daylight." "Indeed." Holmes took a chair. "Pray, enlighten me." Lestrade tapped a paper on his desk. "This came from Denham's bank this morning. He drew out £500 in cash yesterday afternoon. The money is missing from his person. Moreover, he pawned his gold watch at a shop in Drury Lane about the same hour. Here's the pawn ticket, found at Miss Violet Kerr's rooms. The lady claims she knows nothing of it. Holmes took the ticket, studied it briefly, and smiled. A gold watch pawned in the afternoon, yet found upon his body at midnight. Curious, is it not? Lestrade blinked. By George, you're right. Then how? How indeed, said Holmes, rising. You see, Lestrade, even the most honest facts can lie when placed in improper company. For the moment, let us suppose that Denham did pawn his watch. Why, then, was it restored to him before his death? The answer may prove more valuable than the £500. He turned to me. Watson, you will accompany me once again to Regent's Park. The scene of a crime, like a good book, must sometimes be read twice before its meaning becomes clear. The afternoon light was fading when we reached the spot. The lamplighter's pole moved among the gas jets like a shadow come alive. Holmes examined the pavement and the railings with his magnifying glass, paying particular attention to the ground a few yards from where the body had lain. Observe, Watson, he murmured. Here, the prints of a man's boots, Denham's by the pattern. Yet beside them, a smaller, lighter mark, a woman's shoe. Not fresh enough for this morning, yet distinct enough for last night. Our constable failed to notice it. He followed the faint trail a few steps, where it ended abruptly near the curb. A cab stopped here, he said quietly. See the wheel tracks? Narrow gauge. One of the private hire sort, not a public hansom. Someone alighted or entered in haste. If Denham met his end here, he was not alone when he came. Could the woman have been Miss Kerr? I asked. Holmes shook his head. Her account places her at the theatre until after 10, and the walk from St. James's to Regent's Park is too long for her to have arrived before Denham's death. No, the lady of the footprints wore smaller shoes with a higher heel. The evidence is before us, if we choose to read it. He crouched once more, lifting a minute scrap of white fabric from the cobblestones. A thread of cashmere, Watson, torn from the coat. It confirms that the body was moved after death, as I suspected. He died elsewhere, perhaps in some private room or carriage, and was brought here to mislead us. The fog was their ally. Whose ally? I asked. Holmes rose, dusting off his hands. Ah, that is the question, is it not? A woman's coat, a woman's footprints, and a husband dead. The stage is set, and yet our leading actress remains concealed. We returned to Baker Street in thoughtful silence. There, Holmes threw himself into his chair and took up his violin, letting a few low, melancholy notes drift through the air. After some minutes, he set it aside and said abruptly, Watson, there is one link still missing. We must trace that cab. How can you possibly hope to do that in London? With patience and shoe leather. The driver who carried Denham, or his body, must have been paid in gold. Few passengers pay thus at midnight. I have a friend among the cabmen's union who may recall such a fare. That night we dined late, and Holmes went out again alone. When he returned near midnight, his eyes were alight with triumph. Success. A driver named Hobbs recalls taking up a gentleman and a veiled lady outside the stage door of the St. James's Theatre at 10:20. They drove first to a small lodging house in Bloomsbury, stayed perhaps 10 minutes, then continued north toward the park. The lady alighted first, saying she would walk home. The gentleman gave Hobbs a sovereign and dismissed him. The next he saw of the pair was in the morning paper. That proves Denham and Miss Kerr met again after all, I exclaimed. Holmes shook his head. Miss Kerr is fair-haired. Hobbs described the lady as dark and older than the actress by several years. He also remarked on her gloved hands, fine, but trembling. No, Watson, this was not Miss Kerr, but another woman entirely. He leaned back, eyes half closed. There lies the heart of the mystery. A woman who feared discovery enough to move a corpse, yet tender enough to cover it with her own garment. Guilt and compassion rarely share a bed, unless under the quilt of desperation. "You think it was Mrs. Denham?" I whispered. "I think," said Holmes softly, "that the coat's owner has told us but half the truth. Tomorrow we shall test whether her tale of theft can bear the weight of facts. Prepare yourself, Watson. I believe the next visit to Harley Street will not be so calm as the first." He turned again to his violin, and as the somber notes filled the room, I could not shake the vision of the fog-bound park, the pale face of the dead man, and somewhere in the dark streets of London, a woman haunted by the rustle of a cashmere coat. It was shortly after 10 the following morning when we set out once again for Harley Street. The air was crisp and dry, and the usual bustle of London's West End seemed a mockery of the grim errand on which we were bound. Holmes, wrapped in his grey ulster, strode swiftly ahead, his long, nervous hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed upon the pavement as though he were reading invisible print. "Watson," he said suddenly, "truth, like a candle flame, burns brighter the more it is confined. The walls of Mrs. Denham's house conceal more than her grief." "I confess," I replied, "I find her story about the stolen coat difficult to reconcile with the rest." "As well you might," Holmes answered dryly. "Her narrative bears the polish of rehearsal. A theft unreported, a friend unnamed, a husband unmentioned. These are not the marks of candor. Yet let us not judge too soon. A frightened woman may lie without guilt, just as a guilty one may tell a truth to serve deceit." At that moment, the door of Num 24 Harley Street was opened by the same maid who had received us before. She led us to the morning room where Mrs. Denham awaited us. Her complexion was pale, and there were traces of a sleepless night upon her face, yet her bearing remained composed. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "you have learned something, perhaps." "I have learned enough to warrant a few further questions, madam," said Holmes, taking the armchair opposite her. "When we last spoke, you told me your coat was stolen at the St. James's Theatre. Did you, by chance, retain the cloakroom ticket that was issued to you that day?" She hesitated. "No, it was lost, I believe. I had given it to my maid, who misplaced it." "Indeed? Then your maid might recall whether any person loitered near the cloakroom that afternoon." "I cannot say. She left my service 2 days later." Holmes smiled faintly. "An unfortunate coincidence. May I ask where she went?" "I believe she took another position. I do not know where." Holmes rose and crossed to the window, his hands behind his back. "Mrs. Denham," he said at last, "I must be frank. We have traced a cab that left the St. James's Theatre at 10:20 on the night of your husband's death. In it were a gentleman and a lady, both well dressed. They drove first to a lodging house in Bloomsbury and then toward Regent's Park. The lady alighted before the man dismissed the cab. The driver describes her as dark, elegant and of medium height, and wearing gloves. Her composure faltered for an instant, her eyes lowering. "Mr. Holmes," she said at length, "you do not accuse me of being that woman?" I accuse no one, Holmes replied gently. I merely state facts. But I would ask you to explain how your coat, which you say was stolen, came once more into your husband's possession. She pressed a hand to her throat. I cannot explain it, unless he recovered it himself. Perhaps he found the thief and reclaimed it. Ernest was capable of such a thing. He might not have wished to distress me. Holmes's gaze remained upon her face for a long moment. It is a possible conjecture, he said softly, but one that requires proof. You will forgive me if I make certain inquiries. I shall call again, Mrs. Denham. We took our leave without another word. As soon as the door closed behind us, Holmes quickened his pace down the pavement. Watson, he said, the lady's distress is real enough, but her narrative is not. Did you notice the tremor of her hand when I spoke of the gloves? I did. She knows more than she will tell. Now, to Bloomsbury. The lodging house to which Denham and his companion drove may yet yield the missing piece. The address was a modest establishment in a narrow street near Russell Square. The landlady, a cheerful but shrewd woman, greeted us with suspicion until Holmes produced his card. A gentleman and lady? Why, yes, sir, I remember them well. Came about 10:30. The lady asked to use the sitting room for a few minutes. Private, she said. They were gone before the clock struck 11. Paid in gold. Did you hear any names? No, sir, but I recall something peculiar. The lady left behind her handkerchief. I kept it in case she returned. Holmes's eyes gleamed. You have it still? She fetched a small square of fine linen from a drawer. Holmes examined it closely. The embroidery upon the corner bore the initials C.D. Mrs. Clara Denham, Holmes murmured. Thank you, madam. You have rendered Scotland Yard a service. Back in the cab, Holmes turned to me with quiet satisfaction. You see, Watson, the chain tightens. Mrs. Denham was with her husband that night. The meeting at the theatre, the drive to Bloomsbury, the subsequent journey to the park. It all fits. She lied. But why? That is the point upon which the case hinges. He fell silent for several minutes, his eyes half closed, his fingers tapping lightly upon his knee. Then suddenly he said, Let us test one final thread. There remains Miss Violet Kerr. If Denham was in peril, it may be she who knows the nature of that danger. A visit to the theatre once more, my dear Watson, and we may begin to see the whole picture. We found Miss Kerr in rehearsal for a new play, but she received us in her dressing room with an air of relief rather than annoyance. Oh, Mr. Holmes, she exclaimed, I have thought of nothing but that dreadful night. You must believe me. I told you all I knew. I am certain you did, said Holmes kindly. But one detail troubles me. Mr. Denham spoke of a woman who might ruin him. Do you recall his exact words? She furrowed her brow. Only that she had knowledge of something. Something he had done at the bank, I think. He was terrified that she would go to the papers or the police. Holmes's expression grew intent. A woman at the bank, perhaps. I don't know. But he said she had proof in her possession. Letters, maybe. And that she demanded money. He begged me to tell him what to do. I said he must go to his wife and confess everything. And what did he reply? He laughed, a dreadful, hopeless laugh, and said she was the last person he could tell. Holmes drew a deep breath. Thank you, Miss Kerr. You have been most helpful. Outside in the street, Holmes turned to me abruptly. "Watson, we have it now. A man ruined by speculation, blackmailed by a woman who knew his secret, and a wife who learns too late the truth. There remains but one task, to prove how last night's quarrel ended in death. For that, we shall require Lestrade, and courage, for the hour will be delicate." He hailed a cab, and as it carried us towards Scotland Yard through the gathering dusk, I saw in his face that peculiar gleam of anticipation which always heralded the unravelling of some intricate knot. "The game is afoot once more," he said quietly. "And by tonight, Watson, the mystery of the cashmere coat shall no longer hang in fog." By the time the lamps were lit that evening, the city had wrapped itself once more in its habitual November gloom. A fine drizzle glistened on the cobblestones as Holmes and I entered the familiar corridors of Scotland Yard. Inspector Lestrade awaited us, his expression a curious mixture of irritation and curiosity, for he knew by experience that when Holmes appeared uninvited, some revelation was sure to follow. "You've been busy, Mr. Holmes," he said as we took our seats. "Word reaches me that you've been stirring up half of Bloomsbury in this Denham affair. Have you discovered something new?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Only that the case, which at first appeared simple, has been rendered needlessly complex by certain human emotions, chiefly fear, pride, and love. Before I say more, may I ask whether you have learned anything fresh since yesterday?" Lestrade consulted a notebook. "Not much. The coroner confirms the death resulted from a single blow to the temple. No weapon, likely from a fall. Time of death around 10:15. We also found traces of lilac powder on his collar and sleeve. And this, perhaps, will interest you. We've located Mrs. Denham's former maid, the one she claimed lost the cloakroom ticket." Holmes's eyes brightened. "Indeed? Where is she?" "Name of Emma Rance. Took service in Bloomsbury. She's here now, waiting outside." "Then by all means, bring her in." A slight, pale-faced girl entered, curtsied nervously, and looked from Lestrade to Holmes. "Don't be frightened," said Holmes gently. "We merely wish for the truth. You were employed by Mrs. Denham until a week ago?" "Yes, sir." "You attended her at the theatre last Thursday?" "Yes, sir. She wore her new cashmere coat." "And it was lost that day?" The girl twisted her fingers. "Well, sir, not exactly lost. I gave it to a gentleman by mistake." Holmes leaned forward. "By mistake? Describe him." "He came up to the cloakroom window and handed me a ticket, just like the one I held. Said he'd come for Mrs. Denham's coat. I thought no harm, sir, and gave it to him. Then, when my mistress sent me later, it was gone." "Did you tell her?" "Yes, sir. She was terrible angry, said I was careless and dismissed me the next day. I swear, sir, I didn't mean no wrong." Holmes's gaze softened. "Of course not. Do you recall anything else about the gentleman?" She thought for a moment. "Middle-aged, dark moustache, dressed fine. Oh, and he had a mole by his left eye." Holmes's lips curved into a cold smile. "A mole, indeed. Thank you, Miss Rance. You have been most helpful." When she had gone, Lestrade turned to him eagerly. "You know the man?" "I have my suspicions," said Holmes. "But before we draw conclusions, let us test them. I must ask, Lestrade, that you accompany me to Harley Street this evening. There are questions only the presence of the law can compel an answer to." The inspector agreed, though not without a grimace. "Very well. But if this ends in nothing, you'll owe me a dinner." "Gladly," said Holmes. "If it ends in nothing, I shall pay the bill and confess myself beaten, a thing I have yet to do. It was nearly 8 o'clock when our cab drew up before the Denham residence. A butler admitted us, showing evident surprise at our late arrival. Mrs. Denham awaited us in the drawing room, her figure framed by the flicker of the fire. She had changed since the morning. Her pallor was replaced by a feverish brightness, and her eyes shone with suppressed agitation. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector Lestrade, this visit at such an hour." "Forgive the intrusion, madam," said Holmes. "But truth, as I have often observed, keeps no hours. You have told us your coat was stolen, yet we now know the identity of the person who took it from the cloakroom." Her hand trembled as she clasped it upon the arm of her chair. "Who was it?" "Your husband." A faint cry escaped her lips. "He obtained it by presenting the cloakroom ticket. Perhaps one you had misplaced, perhaps a duplicate. He then met you at the theatre last night. You went with him to Bloomsbury, where a quarrel took place. You left, frightened, and he followed, or tried to. A fall, a blow, and death followed. You then covered the body with your coat, the same coat which had once been yours. Is that not the truth?" For a long moment there was silence save for the ticking of the clock. Then Mrs. Denham rose slowly, her face white as the marble mantle behind her. "You are very clever, Mr. Holmes," she said in a low voice. "Too clever, perhaps, for mercy. Yes, it is true that I met him, but I did not kill him. I went because I learned of his infatuation with Miss Kerr. I meant only to plead with him. He was distraught, spoke wildly of disgrace, of money lost, of a woman who held proofs against him. I begged him to come home. Then he fell. I swear to you it was an accident." Her voice broke and she sank into a chair, covering her face. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "The evidence will support her statement. The bruise was from a fall, not a blow delivered. The body was moved, yes, but not from malice, from fear. A woman in shock, seeking to hide her presence, acted without reason. Inspector, you have here not a murderess, but a tragic witness to a man's ruin." Lestrade frowned. "Still, the law will take its course," said Holmes firmly. "But with consideration. Mrs. Denham will accompany you to the yard for her formal statement. I will vouch that she speaks truthfully." The inspector nodded, and after some whispered words of comfort from Holmes, the poor lady was led away. As we walked back through the dim streets, I could not help but ask, "You believe her entirely innocent, then?" Holmes's expression was grave. "In the eyes of the law, perhaps not, but in the eyes of reason, yes. Denham's death was the culmination of guilt and despair. His own acts destroyed him. The coat, symbol of his wife's purity, was the last thing he touched, as though seeking forgiveness. He drew his collar close against the mist. Yet there remains one shadow unaccounted for, the woman who blackmailed him. Her role, though hidden, is central to the tragedy. We shall find her, Watson, though it may take every candle of logic we possess." And with that, he hailed a passing cab, his eyes glinting with renewed purpose. "To the theatre, my dear fellow. The final curtain has not yet fallen." The following day dawned bleak and still, as though London itself held its breath in expectation. Holmes was already at work when I awoke. His slender figure bent over a scatter of papers, telegrams, and clippings spread across our breakfast table. His eyes were bright with that peculiar fire which always marked the scent of discovery. The remnants of an untouched meal sat beside him, the coffee gone cold. "You rise late, Watson," he said without looking up. "It is past 9, and the city has already whispered half its secrets to those who know how to listen." "I see you have been at it since dawn," I remarked, pouring myself a cup of tea. "Is it Denham's case still?" "Entirely. The shadow I mentioned last night has begun to take form. Observe these telegrams." He pushed a handful toward me. "I have made inquiries into Denham and Cohn's affairs. The bank's ledgers show irregular withdrawals over the past 3 months. Funds diverted to an account under the name of Miss V. Kerr. Curious, do you not think?" "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. Then Miss Kerr was indeed the blackmailer. Holmes shook his head. "Not so fast. That would be too convenient. The money, I suspect, never reached her hands. A false account, a borrowed name. It is the oldest of tricks. The true blackmailer would scarcely use her own identity in a public ledger. No, my dear Watson, someone wished us to believe Miss Kerr guilty. Someone close enough to Denham's household to know his secrets, and hers." He rose, pacing before the fire with his usual restlessness. "Last night's confession of Mrs. Denham, though incomplete, was sincere. Her husband's despair, his flight through the fog, the accidental fall, all are clear. But the hidden motive behind that despair remains. A banker ruined by speculation might end his life, but one blackmailed by a trusted confidant will drag down others in the fall. There lies the sting." At that moment, a knock sounded, and Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes tore it open eagerly, his face lit with grim satisfaction. "Ha! Just as I expected. Listen, Watson. Miss Violet Kerr left London suddenly this morning for Paris, accompanied by unknown lady answering description of Mrs. Denham's maid Emma Rance. Signed, Lestrade." "By Jove!" I cried. "The maid and the actress together. What could that mean?" Holmes snatched his hat from the peg. "That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we shall discover. Quick! The Dover Express leaves in an hour. The trail grows hot." Within that hour, we were in a cab, rattling toward Charing Cross through the drizzle. Holmes's manner was one of cold precision. "Do you recall Emma Rance's story?" he said. "She gave the coat to a gentleman with a mole by the eye, yet her account had a rehearsed quality. What if the gentleman never existed? What if the maid herself delivered the coat, by instruction, not mistake? To Miss Kerr? Perhaps, but more likely to the person who played upon both women's fears. Consider, Denham's ruin depended on secrecy. A servant learns something, an actress receives a promise, and both are manipulated by a clever hand. The cashmere coat, Watson, is not the symbol of jealousy alone. It is the key to a conspiracy. The journey to Dover was a long one, broken only by Holmes's occasional notes in his pocketbook. As the train thundered through the winter landscape, he leaned back, eyes half closed, his mind clearly at work upon some intricate pattern invisible to all but himself. We reached the harbour as the Channel steamer was preparing to depart. Holmes purchased 2 tickets, and we boarded swiftly, the cold wind whipping the mist into our faces. From the deck, he scanned the crowd of passengers with his keen gaze. Presently, he touched my arm. "There," he whispered. "At the stern, Miss Kerr, and beside her, the maid." The actress looked pale and anxious, her face half hidden by a veil. The maid clung to her arm, whispering nervously. Holmes motioned me to remain back while he approached them quietly. "Good morning, Miss Kerr," he said in his most courteous tone. "It seems your holiday begins in haste." She turned sharply, her lips parting in surprise. "Mr. Holmes, this is unexpected." "Scarcely more so than your sudden departure," he replied evenly. "May I ask whether your companion accompanies you by invitation or compulsion?" Emma Rance's face blanched. I don't know what you mean, sir." "Oh, I think you do," said Holmes gently. "The truth, if you please. It is the only passport that will save you both from ruin." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Miss Kerr gave a little cry and clutched Holmes's sleeve. "You must protect me. I meant no harm. It was she, Emma, who brought me the letters, Denham's letters, and said I could use them to recover money he owed me. I thought only to frighten him. But she took the money herself." "That's a lie," the maid burst out. "You told me to do it, miss. You said he'd cheated you, and we'd both be rich. You made me fetch the coat and meet him at the theatre." Holmes raised a hand for silence. "Enough. Between you, the truth has emerged, though not cleanly. You, Miss Kerr, played with fire. You, Emma, stole the fuel. The result was a man's death and a woman's misery. The law shall decide your measure of guilt." He turned to the ship's purser, who had approached in alarm. "These ladies will not be sailing to France. Kindly arrange for them to be escorted to the authorities in London. Inspector Lestrade will be awaiting them." When all was settled and the two trembling women taken ashore under guard, Holmes and I returned to the train. As the wheels clattered once more toward the city, I could not help but ask, "You knew then that the maid was the real culprit?" Holmes smiled faintly. "From the moment she spoke of the mole. It was an unnecessary detail, added by guilt to make her story convincing. The simplest lies always bear the most ornament." "And Miss Kerr?" "An accomplice by vanity, not malice. She was used and discarded as Denham was. The maid learned her master's secrets, saw her opportunity, and extorted him through the actress's name. When the scheme went awry, she sought flight and safety. But there is no safety for the wicked once reason follows the scent." He leaned back, his expression one of quiet weariness. "You see, Watson, in this world, crime is rarely born of hatred. It is born of weakness, a stolen coat, a frightened servant, a foolish woman, and a man destroyed. There is no mystery so dark that it does not begin in some small vanity." Outside, the fog was closing once more over the Thames as we approached London. Holmes drew his coat around him and murmured, "One might almost pity them, if not for the cost." I said nothing, for in the dim reflection of the carriage glass, I saw the faint outline of my friend's face, sharp, austere, and infinitely tired, and I knew that beneath his triumph there lay the melancholy of one who has looked too long into the shadows of human folly. When we returned to Baker Street that night, the lamps were already burning low, and a thin drizzle spattered the panes with a sound like whispered conversation. Holmes cast his hat upon the table, loosened his scarf, and went straight to the fire, where he stood for a long moment in silence, his tall figure drawn in sharp relief against the glow. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "another chapter closed, though not, I fear, one that leaves a pleasant taste upon the tongue." I nodded, settling into my chair opposite him. "You have saved two foolish women from crossing the Channel, and perhaps spared Mrs. Denham a heavier sorrow than she already bears. But tell me, do you consider the matter concluded?" Holmes shook his head. "Not quite. There remains the moral accounting. A life is lost, and the chain of cause and consequence must be made plain. Denham's death was the culmination of many small deceits, each link forged by a separate hand, yet all leading inevitably to tragedy. Until I have pieced together that final chain, the case is not, in my own conscience, resolved." He drew his pipe from the mantel and began to fill it, his movements mechanical. The soft crackle of the fire punctuated the steady rasp of his match. "You see, Watson," he continued, "crime rarely springs full-grown from evil. It is rather a plant that grows unseen until the stem thickens and the fruit appears poisonous. The servant's greed, the actress's vanity, the husband's weakness, and the wife's silence all fed the same root." He smoked for a while in silence, the blue tendrils curling toward the ceiling. Then, abruptly, he rose and crossed to his writing desk. "I must write to Lestrade," he said. "The evidence will satisfy the magistrate, but the law must act within its limits. The maid, Emma Rance, will face trial for theft and conspiracy. Miss Kerr for attempted extortion. Mrs. Denham's part, though grave, will be treated with leniency, for her guilt lies in concealment rather than crime." As he spoke, I could not help but think of the pale woman we had left behind in Harley Street, her hands clasped, her gaze fixed on the fire as though it held the face of her lost husband. "Do you think she truly loved him, Holmes?" I asked quietly. Holmes paused, pen in hand. "She did, Watson. Of that I have no doubt. But love alone does not make saints of us. It was love that drove her to the theatre that night, love that made her follow him into the fog, and love that led her to hide what she believed a shameful truth. She acted as many would, from impulse, not malice." He sealed his letter and tossed it aside. "And now, my dear fellow, since the human heart has been sufficiently dissected for one day, let us turn to something less morbid. There's a new monograph in the Lancet on toxic alkaloids. I find it a salutary tonic after such affairs." But even as he spoke, I could see that his mind was not yet free. His eyes retained that inward look, as though tracing invisible lines through the haze of smoke. The clock chimed midnight before he stirred again. The following morning brought Lestrade to our door, his usual briskness tempered by a certain grudging respect. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, seating himself uninvited, "your deductions were right again. More's the pity for my pride. We've got both women in custody. The maid's confession matches your theory word for word. She'd been intercepting Mr. Denham's letters for months, forging notes and siphoning money from the bank. The actress lent her name, not knowing the half of it. It was the maid who blackmailed the poor man, and when he discovered the trick, she panicked." Holmes inclined his head. "Did she admit to meeting him the night he died?" "She did. Said he demanded back the letters, and she threatened exposure. Then Mrs. Denham arrived unexpectedly. She'd been following him. The two women quarreled. Denham tried to intervene, slipped, and struck his head against a railing. When he fell, both women fled. The maid hiding the body, the wife too shocked to act. A sorry business." "Indeed," said Holmes softly, "and yet the explanation fits every thread. You see, Lestrade, the simplest answer was always before us. A man's fall, literal and moral, brought about by deceit and fear. No master criminal here, No Moriarty of the drawing room, only the commonplace tragedy of weak hearts and sharper minds. Lestrade gave a short laugh. Well, I'll say this much, Mr. Holmes. You make it sound almost poetic. The magistrate will see less romance in it, I dare say. But London's safer for your meddling, as usual. When the inspector had gone, Holmes stood looking out into the street, where the fog was once more descending like a theatre curtain at the close of some grim play. "Do you ever reflect, Watson," he said after a pause, "that our city is itself a great stage upon which the passions of mankind act their dramas unseen? The villains we pursue are but players, and we their weary critics." I smiled, and you, Holmes, their most relentless reviewer. He laughed quietly, a sound rare enough to startle me. Perhaps, but every play must have its final act, and so must this one. That afternoon, we walked together to Regent's Park. The scene of the tragedy had resumed its ordinary air. Children played near the railings, a vendor shouted his wares, and the gas lamps stood silent under the pale daylight. Holmes paused at the spot where Denham had fallen. "Strange, is it not?" he murmured. "How quickly the world forgets. Last week, a man lay dead here. The newspapers cried out for justice, and now all trace is gone, save a faint mark upon the stone. Yet, for one woman, that mark will never fade." He stooped, plucked a withered leaf from the ground, and let it drift away on the breeze. "The cashmere coat, Watson, the symbol of tenderness turned to tragedy. It began as a token of affection, became the instrument of deceit, and ended as the shroud of remorse. Few cases have left such an aftertaste." As we turned back toward Baker Street, I noticed that his stride had slowed, and his voice, when he spoke again, was tinged with something almost humanly sad. "There are times," he said, "when I wonder whether the pursuit of truth is not itself a cruelty. We drag from the shadows those who might have lived out their lives in peace and call it justice. Yet, perhaps, the exposure of deceit is the only mercy this imperfect world affords." I made no reply. The wind carried the faint echo of his words through the park, mingling with the rustle of bare branches and the distant hum of the city. By the time we reached Baker Street, he had recovered his usual briskness, humming under his breath as he hung up his hat. And so the case of the cashmere coat passed into the long record of my friend's triumphs, less sensational than some perhaps, but marked by that peculiar blend of intellect and compassion which made Sherlock Holmes at once the most formidable and the most human of men. Several weeks had passed since the affair of the cashmere coat had run its course. The newspapers had already forgotten it, the courts had delivered their measured verdicts, and London had moved on to fresh scandals and crimes. Yet, in our rooms at Baker Street, the echo of that strange case lingered like the faint scent of lilac that had clung to the murdered banker's garment. Holmes, though outwardly composed, retained a thoughtful abstraction that I had learned to recognize as the lingering shadow of some unsatisfied curiosity. It was on a cold, clear morning in December that I found him at the window, gazing down upon the busy street below, his dressing gown drawn close about him. He looked up as I entered, a faint gleam of humor in his eyes. "Watson," he said, "you are about to reproach me for idleness, are you not?" "I was only going to observe," I replied, "that the season seems unusually quiet. You have not had a single visitor these past 10 days." "True," he said, turning back to the window. London sleeps between crimes, as a serpent digests between meals. But though no new case has found its way to our door, the last has not yet finished with us. The Denham affair? Precisely. It has left certain small questions unanswered, details so trifling that only an over-curious mind would trouble itself with them. Yet they persist, like the ticking of a watch in a silent room. I smiled. You mean to tell me, Holmes, that you are still thinking about that unfortunate man and his coat? Thinking, Watson, is perhaps too strong a word. Reflecting, rather. Consider. We traced the theft, the blackmail, the fatal accident. All seemed accounted for. Yet one element remains oddly misplaced. Why did Denham carry that theatre ticket at all? He had no reason to attend a performance that evening. His purpose was confrontation, not amusement. And yet the stub found in his pocket bore a seat number. Someone had planned to meet him there, someone who expected him to sit quietly among the audience until the appointed hour. I leaned forward, but the theatre was crowded. How could such a meeting take place? By arrangement, naturally. Denham was to sit in row D, seat 8, and a signal, a glance, a gesture would summon him to the rendezvous. Yet when he left the theatre, he went not to the stage door at once, but by way of the lobby. What did he see, or whom did he follow? That, Watson, is what I intend to discover. Before I could protest, he had seized his coat and gloves. Come, he said briskly. The St. James's Theatre is not far, and I find exercise stimulates the faculties. The manager, an affable man with whom Holmes was already acquainted, received us with deference. Ah, Mr. Holmes, the Denham case. A tragic business indeed. I suppose the matter is now settled. For the public, yes, said Holmes. But you may help me with a small point. On the night of the accident, do you recall who occupied the seats near row D, seat 8? The manager furrowed his brow. Let me see. That would be near the centre of the house. I believe Lady Armitage and her party were in D5 to D7, and a certain Mr. Basil Harker, the critic, in D9. He is a regular patron. Mr. Basil Harker, repeated Holmes thoughtfully. A journalist, is he not? Yes, of the Evening Chronicle. He often reviews our plays. When we left the theatre, Holmes's eyes had grown keen with purpose. Watson, I suspect that Mr. Harker knows more than he has told the public. Journalists, like vultures, circle above tragedy before the rest of us glimpse its bones. That afternoon we called upon the critic at his lodgings in Bloomsbury. He received us cordially, though not without a flicker of apprehension when Holmes introduced himself. Ah, Mr. Holmes, I trust you have not come to question my reviews, he said with a nervous laugh. Not at all, Holmes replied. I am interested in your recollections of the evening of November 12th, the performance at the St. James's Theatre. Harker's expression changed. Ah, yes, the night of the Denham affair. I remember it vividly. I was seated beside him, in fact. We exchanged a few words in the interval. Indeed? What manner of words? Nothing of consequence. He seemed restless, ill at ease, asked the time once or twice, then left before the final act. I thought little of it. Holmes leaned forward. Did he say whom he was waiting for? The critic hesitated. No, but he did glance several times toward one of the private boxes. I assumed he was looking for a friend. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A friend, or an enemy. Which box? Number 3, on the left. Holmes rose abruptly. You have been most helpful, Mr. Harker. Pray do not mention this conversation to anyone." Outside, he hailed a cab and gave the driver a quick instruction. When I asked where we were bound, he smiled. "To Harley Street, Watson. Box 3 was rented that night in the name of Mrs. Denham." We were admitted to the house by the butler, who, recognizing us, ushered us into a small morning room. Mrs. Denham entered a few minutes later, calm but visibly anxious. "Mr. Holmes, I thought my ordeal was over," she said. "I regret to intrude once more, madam, but there is a detail which troubles me. You were present at the St. James's Theatre on the night of your husband's death." She started, her lips parting in shock. How could you know that?" "Because Box 3 was taken in your name, though you claim to have lost your coat at that same theatre a week earlier. You followed your husband there, did you not?" Her composure faltered. "Yes," she whispered at last. "I could not help myself. I suspected he would meet her, the actress. I sat there, hidden in the shadows, watching. When he left, I followed." Holmes's voice softened. "And what did you see?" "I saw him go to her dressing room. I waited until he came out again, then I followed him into the street. It was I who called to him through the fog. He turned, startled, stepped back, and fell." She covered her face. "It was my fault. My jealousy killed him." Holmes regarded her gravely. "No, madam. His ruin was complete before that moment. You merely unveiled what he had long concealed, but your honesty now will spare others needless pain." When we left, the winter dusk was falling fast, and a light snow had begun to drift across the pavements. Holmes walked in silence for some distance, his head bent, his face unreadable. At last, he said, "So ends the final act, Watson. No murder, no grand conspiracy, only the fatal intersection of pride, passion, and despair. The world will see it as an accident, and perhaps that is just. But we, who know the truth, shall remember it as one of life's quiet tragedies." I could find no words to answer. The snow muffled the city's noises, and in that deepening hush we walked on side by side toward Baker Street, leaving behind us the last faint echoes of the mystery of the Cashmere coat. The new year came to London, draped in fog and frost, the gas lamps glowing like distant stars through a pale haze. Though the case of Ernest Denham had long since been consigned to public memory, Holmes's mind remained unwilling to let it rest. I found him one January morning pacing before the fire, his dressing gown flung back from his shoulders, the smoke from his pipe curling like spectral fingers through the cold air. "You may think me fanciful, Watson," he began, "but there are chords in the Denham affair that continue to vibrate faintly, even after the main melody has ceased. I have an instinct, perhaps only that the banker's tragedy was not entirely self-contained." I looked up from the newspaper I had been perusing. "Surely, Holmes, everything has been accounted for. The maid's confession was full, the actress's role was exposed, and Mrs. Denham's own part, tragic as it was, explained the rest." "Indeed," he replied, "and yet certain small inconsistencies remain. Consider, the maid Emma Rance declared she intercepted her master's correspondence and delivered his letters to an unknown confederate. The identity of that confederate was never discovered. Her explanation, that she left them beneath a loose brick in a garden wall, is, I think, too theatrical to be true. I would wager that some person of higher station directed her actions. Then you suspect a fourth accomplice? Holmes nodded. Precisely. A hand that remained unseen, yet benefited most. I have reason to believe the missing funds from Denham's bank, some £3,000, were never traced. They vanished, not into Emma Rance's pockets, but into a safer vault. He crossed to his desk and spread out several sheets of notepaper covered in his neat, angular handwriting. You will recall that the blackmail payments were drawn by Denham himself and deposited under the name Miss Violet Kerr. The account was closed 2 days before Denham's death, and the balance withdrawn in full. The signature upon the withdrawal slip was a forgery, but not the maid's. It bears a style too refined, too practiced. Then who? I asked. Holmes tapped the page lightly. Therein lies our next inquiry. I sent a specimen to the Bank of England's handwriting expert. The reply came this morning. The writing matches that of a certain Mr. James Larrabee, solicitor of Bedford Row. Larrabee, I exclaimed. Surely not the same man who was once involved in that scandal with the forged deeds. The very same, said Holmes. He escaped prosecution through clever manipulation of evidence, but his reputation never recovered. He now lives in genteel obscurity, acting as confidential advisor to various wealthy clients. One of those clients, I find, was Ernest Denham. Holmes reached for his hat and cane. Come, Watson. The morning is young, and I have a fancy to renew my acquaintance with Mr. Larrabee. We found the solicitor in a dimly lit office lined with dusty law books and the odor of stale tobacco. Larrabee was a small, dapper man with sharp eyes and a manner at once servile and guarded. He welcomed us with professional politeness, though I noticed the flicker of apprehension when Holmes announced his name. I believe you were acquainted with the late Mr. Denham, Holmes began. Larrabee hesitated, then inclined his head. A client, yes. A man much distressed by financial difficulties, though I did my utmost to assist him. In assisting him, said Holmes quietly, you opened an account under a false name and transferred a large sum to your own keeping. I have the proof here. He tapped his breast pocket. Would you care to explain the transaction before I place the matter before Scotland Yard? Larrabee's lips tightened. You go too far, Mr. Holmes. The money was repayment of a private debt. Ah, said Holmes. Then you will have no objection to producing the promissory note which confirms that debt. The man's composure wavered. It was verbal. Holmes smiled thinly. Of course, and doubtless the verbal witness has since died conveniently. Come, Mr. Larrabee, let us not waste words. You exploited Denham's weakness, obtained funds under false pretenses, and when he sought to expose you, you set the maid upon him through the promise of shared reward. You are the unseen hand behind the tragedy. The solicitor sank into his chair, his face ashen. You cannot prove it, he muttered. Holmes regarded him steadily. I can prove enough to end your career. Whether you stand in the dock or merely in disgrace is for you to decide. For a moment, there was silence save for the ticking of the clock. Then Larrabee reached for a drawer, withdrew a small packet of papers, and placed them upon the desk. Take them, he said hoarsely. They are the securities Denham entrusted to me. I meant to restore them when the matter cooled. Holmes examined the packet briefly, then turned to go. Your contrition comes too late, but it may spare you prison. Good day, Mr. Larrabee. Once in the street, I could no longer restrain my curiosity. "Holmes, why let him go? The man is guilty." "Guilty, yes," he replied, "but not of murder. Denham's fall was of his own making. Larrabee merely loosened the final stone beneath his feet. The law will ruin him more thoroughly than any jail. The exposure of fraud to a solicitor is professional death." We returned to Baker Street as the winter dusk descended, the faint glow of gaslight flickering upon the wet pavement. Holmes threw the recovered papers upon the table and regarded them with a mixture of triumph and melancholy. "You see, Watson," he said, "how greed weaves its web through all classes. A banker, a lawyer, a servant, each in turn seeking advantage, each destroyed by the same impulse. There is no riddle in human nature so constant as avarice." He took up his violin and drew from it a low reflective note that hung in the air like a sigh. Thus, the final thread is tied. The cashmere coat, the perfume, the watch, all the tokens of vanity and fear have yielded their secrets. What remains is only the silence of consequence. As I watched him, the bow stilling in his hand, I realized that the case had touched even his iron temperament. For beneath the precision of his logic, there lingered the quiet sorrow of one who, having seen too deeply into the hearts of men, finds little in them to admire and much to forgive. That night, as I set down the final record of the mystery of the cashmere coat, I could still hear the faint, haunting strains of his violin echoing through the fog outside our window, a requiem for the guilty and the lost alike. February brought with it a bitter wind, the kind that scoured the very marrow from one's bones. London lay under a thin shroud of frost, the Thames sluggish and grey beneath the bridges. The fire burned low in our sitting room at Baker Street, where Holmes sat at his usual post by the hearth, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside him. The Denham affair, which had seemed so neatly concluded, had, against all expectation, stirred again from its grave. It began, as so many of our adventures did, with a single, quiet knock upon our door. Mrs. Hudson admitted Inspector Lestrade, his sharp features more drawn than usual. His hat and coat were crusted with frost, and his expression told us at once that his visit boded no ordinary business. "Holmes," he said, dropping heavily into the nearest chair, "I've come about your friend Larrabee, the solicitor you unmasked. You'll recall that he surrendered Denham's securities and promised to make restitution." "Indeed," Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing. "I remember him as a man to whom repentance came conveniently late." "Well," said Lestrade grimly, "repentance has caught him after all. He was found dead in his chambers last night, gunshot wound to the temple, revolver still in his hand, door locked from the inside." "A suicide, then," I murmured. "So it would seem. But there are details that don't quite sit right. He'd sent his clerk home early, and the only note we found was addressed to a woman. No name, only the words, 'It is over. The debt is paid.'" Holmes leaned forward, every line of his lean figure alert. "A woman, you say, and no indication of her identity?" "None," said Lestrade. "But his manservant swears a lady called on him yesterday afternoon. Well-dressed, heavily veiled, and in a cab. He caught only a glimpse, but he swears she was tall and dark. The description might fit 100 women in London, or none." Holmes rose and began to pace. "The coincidence is too pointed, Lestrade. A man who held the key to Denham's ruin, dead by his own hand not a month after the affair is closed. and in the company, or at least the memory, of a woman. No, my dear Inspector, the matter smells not of remorse, but of reprisal. Lestrade gave a short laugh. You mean murder? Impossible. The door was locked, the weapon in his own hand. Holmes smiled faintly. The most perfect crimes, my dear Lestrade, are those which imitate nature's simplest explanations. The locked room is a familiar trick to any hand that knows where to turn the key. Tell me, was there powder upon his fingers? Lestrade hesitated. No. Curiously enough, there wasn't. Then we may dismiss suicide, said Holmes quietly. The weapon was fired by another. The question is, by whom and why now? He turned to me suddenly. Watson, fetch my coat. We dine tonight in Bedford Row. It was nearing 7 when we reached Larrabee's chambers, a tall, narrow building overlooking the frozen square. A constable admitted us and stood aside as Holmes examined the room. The air was heavy with the stale odour of gunpowder and tobacco. Papers lay scattered across the desk, and a revolver rested beside an overturned chair. Holmes moved silently, his gaze taking in every detail. Observe, Watson, the lamp. Turned low, yet the man was found seated as though reading. No sign of struggle, but see how the ink upon the desk is smudged, as though a hand brushed against it after the final word was written. He lifted the dead man's note with his tweezers. The handwriting is steady to the end. A man who writes thus does not intend immediate self-destruction. And note, the debt is paid. What debt, Lestrade? The inspector shrugged. We assumed he meant Denham's business. Perhaps conscience caught up with him. Holmes shook his head. Conscience, like influenza, seldom kills the hardened. No, this letter was meant for someone who demanded payment of another kind. He crossed to the fireplace, where a half-burnt scrap of paper clung to the grate. With delicate fingers, he lifted it out. Ah, what have we here? He laid it flat upon the desk and read aloud the remaining words. If you fail, remember, I hold your promise. C.D. Lestrade whistled softly. Mrs. Denham. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Precisely. The circle narrows once again. But before we leap to accusation, let us understand the motive. Larrabee possessed Denham's securities. When exposed, he surrendered them. Yet perhaps he had kept some portion. Perhaps Mrs. Denham discovered it and sought restitution. The phrase, the debt is paid, takes on a new meaning in that light. He examined the revolver closely, sniffing the barrel. Freshly fired, but note the faint trace of perfume. Lilac. Our old companion returns to the scene. For the next hour, Holmes moved about the chamber with methodical precision, taking measurements, examining the door, and inspecting the window latch. At last, he turned to Lestrade. There is your answer. The murderer entered by the outer window. A narrow ledge connects this room to the next building. Dangerous, but not impossible. She entered unseen, forced Larrabee to write the note, and shot him as he sat. The lock was turned from the outside with a wire loop, an old trick. When the body was discovered, all appeared consistent with suicide. Lestrade stared. You're suggesting Mrs. Denham scaled a wall in the middle of the night to shoot a man? Holmes smiled coldly. I suggest nothing of the kind, but someone using her initials wished us to think so. We have here an imitation, a borrowed signature. Our mysterious lady returns, dark, tall, veiled. The same woman who visited Larrabee yesterday. I believe we shall find her identity lies not in Harley Street, but in Bond Street. Madame Lefebvre, I exclaimed. Holmes nodded. The dressmaker who sold Mrs. Denham the cashmere coat. She was more entangled in the affair than she ever confessed. Come, Watson, Lestrade. London's underworld hides many masks behind the counter of fashion. We left the chambers as the clock struck 8. Outside, the snow had begun to fall in earnest, whitening the roofs and softening the gaslight. As we turned toward the Strand, Holmes quickened his pace, his coat flaring behind him. "Do you recall, Watson," he said quietly, "how I told you that the simplest crimes often bear the deepest motives? We have pursued this trail from a dead man in a fog to the drawing rooms of Mayfair, and still the hand that wove the web eludes us. But not for long. Before the week is out, I promise you, we shall look upon the true face behind the mystery of the cashmere coat." His words carried that unmistakable tone of certainty which meant the chase was nearing its end. And as we hurried through the drifting snow, I could not shake the feeling that the final act of our long drama was already waiting, silent, inevitable, and perilous, as only fate itself can be. The next morning dawned grey and bitter, the fog creeping once more over Baker Street like a living thing. Holmes, whose energy never slept when a mystery was afoot, had spent the night poring over maps of Bond Street and reports from his agents. When I rose, bleary-eyed, I found him already dressed, a cup of strong coffee before him, and the glint of resolution in his eyes. "Watson," he said, "today, if I am not mistaken, we draw the final curtain on this sordid play. Our path leads to Bond Street, to Madame Lefebvre's fashionable establishment. You will recall her as the dressmaker who sold Mrs. Denham the ill-fated cashmere coat." "I do indeed," I replied. "But surely she was innocent. She supplied a garment, not a crime." Holmes smiled faintly. "Innocence, my dear Watson, is a matter of definition. There are women who wield a needle as deftly as a dagger. Come, the cab waits." Bond Street glittered that morning despite the gloom, a parade of polished windows and fashionable idleness. We entered Madame Lefebvre's salon to find it already humming with activity. Ladies choosing fabrics, assistants flitting like bright birds among bolts of silk. The proprietress herself approached, smiling her professional smile. "Ah, Monsieur Holmes," she said in her musical French accent. "To what do I owe the pleasure? A commission, perhaps? For the doctor, a new coat?" Holmes bowed slightly. "I fear not, madame. I have come upon a matter of grave importance. It concerns the late Mr. Ernest Denham." For the briefest instant, I saw the colour drain from her cheeks, but she recovered with a laugh. "Ah, that poor man. I remember his wife so well. Such taste. But what has this to do with me?" Holmes's gaze did not waver. "Everything, madame. You were acquainted with Mr. Denham himself, were you not? Do not deny it. He visited your shop 3 days before his death." She drew herself up proudly. "Many gentlemen come here on behalf of their wives. It is nothing unusual." "True," said Holmes, "but few of them leave behind a note bearing your initials." Her eyes flashed. "My initials? Absurd. You have been misinformed." Holmes reached into his pocket and drew out the fragment of scorched paper recovered from Larrabee's fireplace. "This, madame, was written by your hand. The letters C.D. You signed them as Clémence Dufour, your maiden name, the same by which you once conducted less reputable enterprises in Paris. Shall I refresh your memory?" The room seemed to darken. Madame Lefebvre's poise crumbled. She sank into a chair, her gloved hands trembling. "How much do you know?" she whispered. "Enough," Holmes said coldly. "You were once involved with James Larrabee in certain continental frauds. When you fled to England, you established yourself here under a new name. Denham became your client and your victim. Through his vanity and your charm, you gained access to his financial secrets. The maid Emma Rance, a simple tool, was bribed to intercept his correspondence. When the thefts were discovered, Denham threatened exposure. You then contrived the blackmail through Miss Kerr's name, ensuring the money came safely to you. When Larrabee, your former accomplice, turned against you and sought a larger share, you silenced him." Her eyes widened in terror. "No, it was not I. It was the maid. She came to me that day, demanding money. She had letters, proof. She said she would go to the police. I only meant to frighten her. Larrabee was already ruined. I found him dead when I arrived." Holmes regarded her with icy calm. "A convenient tale, and yet the evidence points otherwise. The note found beside Larrabee's body, 'The debt is paid,' was written under duress in his own hand. The faint scent of lilac upon the revolver, the same perfume your assistants wear, these are the signatures of your crime." She buried her face in her hands. "Then it is finished," she murmured. Holmes turned to me quietly. "Watson, will you be so good as to summon a constable? The lady will not attempt flight. She has too much sense for that." When I returned with Lestrade, whom Holmes had prudently sent word to earlier, the scene had not changed. Madame Lefebvre sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the fire. Lestrade, though plainly astonished to find his quarry among the elite of Bond Street, lost no time in performing his duty. "You'll understand, madame," he said awkwardly, "that I must ask you to accompany me to the yard." She rose with dignity, though her face was ashen. "I understand, monsieur. I have played a dangerous game, and it is lost." When she had gone, Holmes stood for a long moment, gazing into the empty hearth. At last, he said, "Thus ends the final chapter, Watson. The woman's hand was upon every page, though written in invisible ink. She lured Denham to ruin, betrayed her confederates, and sought to live among the respectable by the skill of her needle. A remarkable intellect wasted upon deception." I could not repress a shudder. "And to think she stood before us so composed, so polished." "The serpent, my dear Watson," Holmes interrupted gently, "has been the most elegant of creatures since Eden." We left the shop together. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, drifting softly through the grey morning. Holmes walked in silence until we reached the corner, where the fog thickened once more about the gas lamps. "Tell me," I said, "what first led you to suspect her?" "The coat," he replied simply. "A garment of rare quality, sold by a single establishment. From the first, the scent of lilac and the initials CD told me that its maker was nearer the heart of the mystery than its wearer. Every thread of this case began with that coat, and every thread has led back to the same pair of hands." He drew his collar high against the wind. "You see, Watson, there is a curious justice in such things. The instrument of her vanity became the symbol of her guilt. The same soft fabric that shrouded Denham's body will now be evidence against the woman who designed it." We returned to Baker Street by way of the river, where the lamps flickered dimly on the frozen water. Holmes spoke little, though I could tell by the quiet satisfaction in his expression that his mind was at peace. The hunt was over, and the truth, however grim, had been laid bare. That evening, as he sat once more by the fire, I could not resist saying, "You have, at last, solved the mystery of the cashmere coat." He smiled faintly, the smoke from his pipe curling upward like a final question mark. Solved? Perhaps. But not all mysteries end with justice, my dear Watson. Some end only with understanding, and that, too, must suffice. And with that, he turned again to the violin, and the quiet strains of his music rose and fell through the twilight, until London's fog seemed to listen and be still. 2 days after the arrest of Madame Lefebvre, a heavy snow fell upon London, blanketing the streets and muffling the ceaseless clatter of wheels. Baker Street lay wrapped in an unnatural quiet, broken only by the occasional jingle of a passing cab or the distant cry of a newspaper boy calling out some fresh scandal. Within our rooms, however, the air was thick with the familiar aroma of tobacco and the faint rasp of Holmes's violin, though the melody that evening was one of reflection rather than triumph. The case of the cashmere coat had, to all outward appearances, reached its conclusion. Yet Holmes's mind was not one to rest upon verdicts or official declarations. As he drew his bow across the strings with absent rhythm, I saw in his eyes that same restless gleam which had so often preceded a new revelation. "You are dissatisfied," I observed. He lowered the violin and smiled faintly. "Not dissatisfied, Watson. Merely thoughtful. There are patterns, you see, that remain incomplete. A finished puzzle should leave no gaps. And though Madame Lefebvre sits now in the hands of justice, one thread of the tapestry hangs loose." "Surely," I said, "her confession was complete. She admitted her part in Denham's ruin and in Larrabee's death." "Confession," Holmes said dryly, "is a tool of the guilty, not of the truthful. It may serve to purchase leniency, but rarely accuracy. Consider, my dear fellow, Lefebvre claimed that she found Larrabee already dead, yet the revolver bore traces of her perfume and none of his fingerprints. She would have us believe that she touched the weapon after his death, not before. It is convenient, but improbable." I set down my teacup. "Then you think she lied still?" Holmes nodded slowly. "In part, yes. But what intrigues me is the reason. A lie may conceal guilt, or it may conceal another's name. There was, I am persuaded, someone above her, a patron, perhaps, or a partner, who profited even from her fall." Before I could reply, there came a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram upon her tray. Holmes tore it open, his eyes scanning the message swiftly. Then he looked up, the faintest smile upon his lips. "Watson, it seems fate has chosen to gratify my curiosity. Lestrade requests our presence at the Yard, immediately. He has news from Paris." Within the hour we were in Lestrade's office, the inspector's lean face alight with the satisfaction of a man who knows his efforts will impress his more brilliant colleague. "Holmes," he said, "you'll be glad to hear we've received confirmation from the French police. Your Madame Lefebvre, real name Clémence Dufour, was once associated with a certain Baron de Verville, a notorious financier and adventurer. It seems he escaped France some years ago after defrauding several banks. The lady was his companion at the time. There's reason to believe she came here under his instructions. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Indeed. And where is this Baron now? Ah, said Lestrade. That's the best part. He's in London, under another name. Owns a small import business near the Strand. The French are anxious to have him back, but he's kept well hidden. Holmes rose at once. Then we must call upon him without delay. You may bring your warrant, Lestrade, but I shall bring the truth. The address led us to a narrow street near the river, where the dull lamps glowed upon shuttered shops. The sign above the door read, Verville and Co., importers of fine silks. Holmes pushed the door open, and a bell tinkled softly. Inside, amid bolts of fabric and the smell of damp wool, a tall man stood behind the counter, his dark hair silvered at the temples. He greeted us in perfect English, though the faint accent betrayed his origin. Good evening, gentlemen. How may I serve you? Holmes's tone was courteous, yet carried an undercurrent of steel. We seek Baron de Verville, though I believe you have adopted another title of late. The man's expression did not change, but his fingers tightened imperceptibly upon the counter. You are mistaken. My name is Henry Verville. I know nothing of any baron. Then perhaps, Holmes said, producing a folded paper, you will recognize this signature. It appears on several drafts connected to Ernest Denham's missing securities. The man's eyes flickered. Forgery, he said coldly. On the contrary, Holmes replied, it is your own. You were the unseen partner in Madame Lefebvre's scheme. When her position became precarious, you instructed her to recover the securities and silence Larrabee, who had begun to suspect you. She obeyed, and when the noose tightened, you left her to face the gallows alone. A silence followed, broken only by the slow ticking of the shop's clock. Then the man's shoulders relaxed, and he gave a short, mirthless laugh. You are indeed the devil they say you are, Monsieur Holmes. But what will you gain? The woman is arrested. The case is closed. Who will believe her master was a ghost she never named? I will, said Holmes simply, and the courts will follow when they see this. He withdrew from his pocket a letter sealed with wax. Intercepted this afternoon at the post office. Addressed to you, written by her hand. She writes, They have me, but I shall speak no more. I have kept my promise, Henri. A foolish loyalty, to be sure, but damning. For the first time, a shadow of fear crossed the man's face. Lestrade stepped forward briskly. Baron de Verville, I have here a warrant from the French authorities. You'll come quietly, I hope. The Baron gave a slight bow. Ah, well, Paris will be less cold than London. When he was gone, Holmes turned to the inspector. Thus, the final veil is lifted. The tale began with a husband's folly and ends with a woman's silence. All else, blackmail, theft, and death, were but the echoes of their passions. That evening, as we sat once more by the fire, Holmes seemed unusually reflective. It is a curious thing, Watson, he said. In the theatre of crime, the women are seldom the villains, though they play the most compelling parts. This Madame Lefebvre, no, Clémence Dufour. She loved the man who betrayed her, and for that love she perished. It is not justice that triumphs in such cases, but fate. He drew upon his pipe, the glow of the ember lighting his sharp profile. Yet there is satisfaction too. The coat, the perfume, the initials, all have found their meaning. The world calls me a reasoner, but it is emotion, not logic, that drives most tragedies. Remember that, Watson. I shall, I said. He nodded, half smiling. Then perhaps you will write this one down, not as a tale of deduction, but as a study of human frailty. Call it The Mystery of the Cashmere Coat, if you will. It is a good title and a better lesson. And as the fire burned low and the snow fell soft against the window, Holmes sat motionless, the faintest ghost of that melancholy smile upon his lips, the smile of a man who has seen the worst of humanity and forgiven it all the same. The case, which had begun in the fog of Regent's Park and wound through the drawing rooms of Mayfair, had, by March, reached its melancholy conclusion. Baron de Verville, the shadow behind so many ruined lives, awaited extradition to France. Madame Lefebvre, broken and penitent, languished in Holloway jail. The newspapers spoke of the Bond Street conspiracy with a mixture of outrage and fascination, while Sherlock Holmes, as was his habit, turned away from public acclaim with the indifference of a man who sought no applause save that of his own intellect. It was one bleak morning, when a biting wind swept in from the river, that I found him once more at his post before the fire, pipe in hand, his eyes fixed on the curling smoke as though tracing within it the faint hieroglyphics of thought. Upon the table lay several foreign telegrams and a packet of French newspapers. I had barely seated myself before he spoke. "Watson," he said, "do you recall my remark that no puzzle is ever truly solved while a single fact remains obscure?" "I do," I replied. "Surely, though, the Denham affair leaves nothing unexplained." "Nothing," he said softly, "save the human heart. Yet even there, some mysteries invite solution. Observe." He handed me one of the telegrams. It was brief, written in French, and bore the signature of a Paris correspondent with whom Holmes had long maintained a professional acquaintance. I translated aloud. "Baron de Verville found dead in his cell this morning. Circumstances suspicious. Official report, suicide. Whispered cause, poison. Inquiry demanded." I set it down in astonishment. Dead. Then justice has overtaken him after all. Holmes's expression was unreadable. Justice, perhaps, or something less exalted. De Verville possessed secrets that might have compromised more than himself. When such men die suddenly, it is seldom by accident. You think he was silenced? "I think," Holmes said gravely, "that Madame Lefebvre's influence reached farther than the bars of her cell. She had associates still at liberty, disciples of the same creed, prophet without conscience. The serpent may lose its head, but the coils still move." He rose and paced the room, his long hands clasped behind his back. "I have been in correspondence with the French authorities. They suspect an agent named Armand Lenoir, once a chemist in Lyons, now believed to have supplied the Baron with his fatal draught. Lenoir, as it happens, is the very man who arranged Lefebvre's flight from Paris years ago. The two were, how shall I phrase it, business partners. And now he has come to London?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "So it seems. The web tightens again, Watson. Once more we must follow the invisible thread." That afternoon we made our way to the docks, where Holmes's information placed Lenoir among the labyrinthine warehouses of the river trade. The air was raw with salt and soot, the masts of ships looming like a forest against the dim sky. A name upon a manifest, Le Havre Star, guided us to a small office above a chandlery. Holmes entered without ceremony, and a man rose from behind a desk cluttered with ledgers. He was tall, thin, and singularly colourless, his features so ordinary that one might forget them the moment after. yet his eyes, pale, steady, unblinking, betrayed the watchfulness of a snake. "Monsieur Lenoir," said Holmes. The man inclined his head. "At your service, monsieur. And you are—" "A traveller, in truth," Holmes replied. "I have come from Paris, where an old acquaintance of yours has lately passed away." Lenoir's lips curved faintly. "Ah, the Baron. Yes, I have heard. A sad business, though not unexpected. He was a man of delicate nerves." "Delicate, perhaps," said Holmes evenly, "but not suicidal. The poison that killed him was of a peculiar composition, traces of hydrocyanic acid blended with morphia, a preparation known only to one man in Europe." Lenoir's hand, resting upon the desk, trembled ever so slightly. "You flatter me, monsieur." Holmes's smile was razor-thin. "Flattery, no. Accuracy, yes. You were wise enough to use the Baron's death to silence what remained of your partnership's history. But you were unwise to remain in England. The net closes, Monsieur Lenoir, and this time no amount of chemistry will dissolve its cords." For a heartbeat, the man sat motionless. Then, with the suddenness of a striking adder, he seized a small vial from his pocket and flung it to the floor. A sharp hiss filled the room as smoke rose in acrid clouds. Instinctively, I drew my handkerchief to my face, but Holmes, anticipating the move, had already leapt forward. With a deft motion, he wrenched the man's arm behind him and dashed the second vial from his grasp before it could be opened. "Ammonium and ether," Holmes said calmly, as Lestrade, who had been waiting below, burst in with 2 constables. "A crude smoke bomb. Our friend hoped for a dramatic exit." Lenoir's composure had fled. "You cannot prove anything," he hissed as the handcuffs closed about his wrists. "On the contrary," said Holmes, "the proof is written in the very bottle you sought to destroy. The composition is identical to that which killed the Baron, identical even to your own patent proportions. I have here," he added, producing a folded paper from his pocket, "a copy of your application to the Paris Institute of Chemistry. You see, Monsieur Lenoir, the law is patient, but chemistry is precise." That night, back at Baker Street, Holmes allowed himself a rare glass of claret. The case was ended, the final strand severed. He stood at the window, gazing out upon the snow-dimmed lamps. "So ends our affair, Watson," he said quietly. "The Cashmere coat has at last yielded its final secret. From a banker's folly to a criminal's vengeance, from the jealousy of a wife to the poison of a chemist, each act has played its part in this somber symphony." "And you," I said, "as ever, were the conductor." He smiled, faintly and without vanity. "Perhaps, but it is the music that lingers, not the hand that directs it. Remember that, my friend. We solve crimes, but we do not mend hearts." He turned back to the fire, the light glinting upon his thin, ascetic face. "Now, Watson, let us have no more talk of tragedy. I believe there is a case of stolen sapphires awaiting me from Bombay, a cleaner melody, perhaps." And so, as the clock struck midnight and the fog once more wrapped the city in its eternal cloak, the great detective laid aside his violin, his pipe, and, at least for a time, the ghosts of the mystery of the Cashmere coat. The last vestige of winter still clung to London, though the air had begun to soften, and the streets, newly freed from frost, gleamed under a watery March sun. The Denham affair, in all its twisted complexity, had now passed from the gossip of drawing-rooms into the more enduring archives of the Yard. To the public, It was merely another of Holmes's triumphs. One of those cases where the intellect of the detective had outpaced the cunning of crime. But to Holmes himself, it had been something deeper, more personal, a reflection, perhaps, of the strange and shadowed interplay between justice and mercy that haunted his curious mind. It was late one afternoon when I found him alone at the window of our sitting room, the long shaft of light falling across his lean face and the scattered papers upon the table. The violin lay idle beside him. The fire had sunk to ashes. He was reading a letter, its foreign seal already broken. Without turning, he spoke. "A curious postscript to our old case, Watson. Lestrade has written from Paris. Lenoir, our chemist friend, has confessed. Before his execution, he declared that the poison used upon the Baron was not intended for him at all." I looked up in surprise. "Not intended for him? Then for whom?" "For the lady," Holmes said softly. "For Madame Lefebvre herself." I stared. "You mean she—" "He sent her the same vial under pretext of medicine, hoping to silence her before she could speak. But she never used it. The authorities found it among her effects, its seal unbroken. Irony, Watson. The woman who wove destruction for others was spared only by the fickleness of chance. It is, I think, a fitting end." He folded the letter carefully, his expression grave. "You see, my dear fellow, crime seldom perishes neatly. It decays, leaving echoes. The law may close its books, but the reverberation continues in the hearts of those it touches." We sat for a while in silence. Outside, a barrel organ played a plaintive tune in the street below, and the cries of vendors drifted faintly through the open window. Holmes rose at last, stretching his long arms as though to shake off the weight of thought. "I have been considering," he said, "the curious sequence of events that began with a woman's garment. A single misplaced coat, Watson, nothing more. Yet from that trivial accident unraveled the entire fabric of deceit. Love betrayed, greed unmasked, murder revealed. How often, I wonder, does fate choose the smallest thread to weave its greatest designs?" I smiled. "You have always said, Holmes, that there are no small facts." "Quite so," he murmured, lighting his pipe. "It is the observer, not the event, who is large or small. The world presents itself in fragments. Only the trained mind perceives the pattern." He fell into thought, his sharp profile outlined against the pale light. "Do you recall, Watson," he said after a moment, "that when we first stood over Denham's body, I remarked that the fog serves the guilty as a veil? I see now that I spoke too narrowly. It serves the innocent as well. Had the fog not concealed her, Mrs. Denham might have been branded a murderess. The very mist that shrouded crime also shielded her from ruin. There is a strange symmetry in that." I nodded. "And what became of her?" Holmes took a paper from the mantel. "She has left England," he said. "Lestrade's letter mentions that she sailed last week for Canada to live with a cousin near Montreal. She carries with her a modest inheritance and, I trust, a measure of peace. I doubt we shall hear her name again." "Then that is mercy," I said quietly. Holmes smiled, one of those fleeting, rare expressions that softened the austerity of his features. "Perhaps. Yet I sometimes wonder whether mercy and justice are but two faces of the same coin. We flip it, Watson, but it is fate that decides how it lands." He turned to the fire, stirring the embers until a few sparks leapt up and died again. "You may write this case, my friend, when the time is right. But remember, it is not the cleverness of deduction that makes it worth recording. It is the frailty of those involved, the ordinary passions that brought them down. If there is any lesson, it lies there. You forget, I said, that my readers prefer you to philosophy. They will expect the great detective to emerge triumphant, pipe in hand, while the constables look on in admiration. Holmes gave a quiet laugh. Then give them their hero, Watson. The world needs its illusions. But between ourselves, between one man of reason and another, let us not pretend that triumph is always sweet. There are victories, my dear fellow, that leave the heart colder than defeat. The clock on the mantel chimed the hour, and Mrs. Hudson entered with the evening post. Among the letters was a small envelope addressed in a delicate hand. Holmes examined it, broke the seal, and read aloud. To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, though I can never thank you as you deserve, I send you this token of gratitude. Know that I live quietly, and pray that the peace I have found may one day visit you also. Yours sincerely, Clara Denham. Within the envelope was a folded scrap of soft fabric, a piece of cream-coloured cashmere, no larger than a handkerchief. Holmes turned it over thoughtfully in his fingers, then placed it gently in the drawer of his desk. The last relic, he said. Strange, is it not, that all this blood and ruin should end in so delicate a keepsake? A woman's coat, a banker's folly, a thread of silk, and the web is complete. He stood for a while, gazing at the drawer as though it were a memorial to the dead. Then, with a sigh, he reached for his violin. The first notes rose, clear and mournful, filling the room with a melody at once beautiful and tragic. As the music deepened, I sat back and watched him. The slender figure bent in concentration, the smoke curling upward from the lamp, the twilight gathering at the window. There was in that moment the very essence of Sherlock Holmes, the relentless seeker of truth, the solitary artist of reason, and, beneath it all, the quiet humanity that made his brilliance bearable. When the last chord faded into silence, he lowered the violin and said simply, "Thus ends the mystery of the cashmere coat, Watson. Let it rest." And so it did. The fog thickened outside, softening the lamps to halos of gold, and the night closed around Baker Street, as if to draw a curtain on the final act of that strange, sorrowful drama.